is to share the alternatives and hear those. So we need to look for places where we can share those good practices. Now, I'm really hoping, and if the model that you've had in your school has had the impact that you have had, and I think that we should fight for that. And I'm also a member of the NET, and I think if they come and they say that your school has not improved, but you know that it has, you should look to the union as your professional body to support you in that as well. I don't know, I think I can say that. But I think that we look to places where we can publicise those things like good practice as well. So we look to professional journals, we look to websites, we look to all those sort of things to just get that message out so that people in schools like yours...
I thought I was the norm.
I think most people...
Because you are, for a certain time, my last school, that I was observed 4 times in 1 week.
And
there's nothing going on, it was just...
the norm.
That is the norm.
To be fair, I think you probably... looking around, I think you probably are the norm, but I think if people knew that there is an alternative, that's why I think it's important to publicise it, and I think we have to look for that.
Yeah, sorry, jumping over back.
I'm deputy head in a secondary school, and the first thing is, I think there's because we are a school that monitors a lot, and the first thing is in terms of the Ofsted syndrome, you know, when you talk about kind of head teachers, there's a danger you kind of vilify those head teachers as in kind of they're part of the other lot, and they're not actually. That's a real vilification of the Ofsted system. Those head teachers are kind of walked by this kind of political world which says that actually, you know, it is a seismic cliff edge judgment, and if you end up going into requires improvement or inadequate, then it has massive ramifications, not just for you as a head teacher, but for everybody in that school, including every student. And I think it's really easy to be a bit glib about that, but I know you weren't, but I think people often are. But the second thing is, I think, you know, we do all the stuff that you were just talking about. We do learning walks, we do work scrutinies, we do subject reviews, we do lesson observations, we do all of those things. What we don't do is the kind of termly or half-termly data trawl. We do that twice every year. And all of these parts are designed to, it's difficult for Kat because she's in my school, and you know, you don't need to say anything, but they're designed quite genuinely so that we can improve outcomes for students, so that we can help teachers to improve the outcomes for their students, and so that we can help teachers to improve themselves. Now, we're an outstanding school. We get 1,024 value-added score, we get 80% 5A to C. It's easy for us to do those things in a relatively autonomous way without the fear of Ofsted, which you won't have in other schools, and I'm aware of that as well. But I think there's a danger that we kind of suggest, if you're taking this back to another kind of forum, that we suggest that we're not going to do those things because they put people under so much pressure. I'm aware that they do, like you said, you know, when I was observed earlier this term, I was really nervous about it. I've been teaching for 21 years. I've always been pretty good at it, but I still get very nervous when a colleague comes in to watch me. I'm not sure that's the best way of judging a teacher. In fact, I don't think it is. And actually, I think the danger is that you cut back on all those other things and you don't get a holistic sense of the school or the teacher, the person. And actually, you get that really, really unfair kind of momentary judgment. And I've always had a big truck with this, where you go in and you say, you know, my first ever Ofsted inspection, I was watched, and I was a 1 on the old 1-7 scale. But I wasn't a 1. You know, I was in my second year of teaching. But everyone said, go and see Tim Johnson, he's fabulous. But I just had a good day. You know, it's one of those things. So I think there's a real danger that actually we kind of cut back on all this stuff. It's more about the way that we do all of this stuff and the way that we use it. That's important.
I think what I think Kevin was talking about was proportionality and you know, trust and dialogue. You know, if these things are done in a way that people feel they've got some part in or a part of some dialogue, I don't think I would say everything has to be removed, but it's people understanding the purpose and the intended impact. I should say
earlier, didn't you, about, you know, to what extent was it a dialogue?
Yeah.
And that's the key thing.
Yeah.
You know, and I think at the same time, I've got 2 kids of my own in year 7 and year 10, and I always think, you know, would I be happy with my kids being taught in that department by that teacher? And if knows the answer, that teacher's got to be helped, supported, and ultimately accountable, because that's not on either.
I think
So-
there's no debate about the fact we are accountable. You know, we are accountable for students' futures, and like more basically, we are accountable for a vast amount of public money. It's the mechanisms that are being used and that appear to be being, maybe you could possibly say, abused in some situations to get that, and possibly from some misunderstanding or some very narrow interpretation of what's needed to be accountable.
And what actually drives change, because I think if there are some schools where you see and you hear about such high levels of scrutiny, I do wonder, when do the teachers get the brain space to actually think about, I need to think completely exclusively about this group of children and what they need, and not have the voices of how am I going to prove that, how would that look in the classroom. I think sometimes that the method by which we prove we're getting better, in some areas if misapplied, stops us from getting better. And the most important thing is, in these schools that have to have high scrutiny because they're underperforming, actually that the performance changes, not that you have sophisticated scrutiny. I think the other thing is that we as teachers have to accept we have demonised some forms of scrutiny that are actually not as bad as we say they are. Like, people talk about work trawl and book scrutiny, and you see people flinch back from it. It's actually one of the most painless ways of proving how effective your teachers are, because you're not having to watch a snapshot of time. You can see something happens over a process. You are seeing what actually is hitting the books, so what's getting down on paper and lasting longer for that child, and it gives you a wealth of evidence. But teachers hear it, and because it's used in such a negative way in many schools, the response is very hostile to it, when actually there are many teachers who, when they look at it objectively, would say, I'd rather you saw about how this child or this group of children were performing based on what's in their books over 6 months than what you saw at 9:30 on a wet Tuesday morning. But we as teachers we as a profession have got to accept that we have allowed some forms of scrutiny to be demonised. And that needs to
we should be
change.
focusing on the
Yeah.
ways that where we can ensure the accountability more fairly and more validly as well. That's what it is.
And that
I,
will
I think
change, don't
with
it?
all these things, there's a range of practices, aren't there? You know, the book look covers a multitude of practices, doesn't it? There's looking through books and talking to someone about what you're doing and where it's going, and then there's the book look where your books are taken away and someone writes back to you and says we didn't like this or this, and there's no dialogue. You know, there's no dialogue, and it just, where does that go then? Is my concern. Is there anyone else who has?
I was going to
Yeah,
say...
sorry, you had your hand
sorry,
up, and then
I do
gentlemen.
apologise. It's really heartening to hear the models that you're employing and the way that things are developing in your schools. But I work in a local authority, so I go into quite a lot of secondary schools, and I see some where they're veering towards this model, where they try not to judge too often or too harshly, and to put in place a model that facilitates development. But I also go into schools where people will say to me, on this corridor we've got 2 outstanding teachers, we've got 3 RI teachers, and we've got 1 inadequate, can you go and see them please? And that's the model that a lot of people are suffering from. And what happens in those situations is what you've described, where staff leave because they're so miserable, they don't see a way forward. It really is disheartening for them. And I think that is what we've got to change, because you can't have schools that have been categorised, teachers that have been categorised, just leaving. They either need to not be a teacher anymore, and there are people like that in our profession. They shouldn't be there, and we need to have a kinder mechanism for making that happen. Because, I mean, I don't know whether you look round your school and think exactly what you described. Would I like this person teaching my children? That's my mantra. And if I think no, I think, well, why are they still here after 15 years? That's not fair on the kids. But there's also this, you know that you've got really, really good teachers who, because they've had an RI observation, are now petrified. And they're living in fear of being what I've heard described as being performance managed out of their job. And that is a common comment that's been thrown my way. And often because of my role, I get to go and work with these people, and let me tell you, they're not in a happy place. And they're not here today because they've lost their enthusiasm for learning and for teaching. So that's what we need to work on, I think.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear some of these good models, and we do have to talk about how we create create good models and ways forward. But I think there are two problems. One is that they're based on the legacy, really, of Chris Woodhead's statement that there are 15,000 failing teachers from a few years back. And we're still in a situation where the whole system is based on, there's a load of bad teachers, how do we find them, you know? And I think that's the wrong way of looking around. The second thing that's wrong with it is that whatever and however it's developed, it's top down rather than a collegiate sort of involving thing. And I hear your good models and your good schools, but whatever it is that you're doing in your school, it's not because you sat down with your teachers and your staff and said, how should we do this? It's because it's been sort of cascaded down from governments and ministers. Now, when I go back to Alex, and you were talking about, when you qualified and the sort of support that you got. When I did my PGC, it was all about becoming a reflective teacher. At the end of the day, at the end of the period or whatever, you consider what you've done and what's gone well and what hasn't gone well. And I know that myself as a teacher, that sometimes I'm outstanding, sometimes I'm absolutely rubbish. And that will go on from day to day. I've got not a problem with that sometimes I will have a terrible lesson and I'll go away and think, as long as I'm reflective about it and honest to myself and my colleagues, then we can do something about it. But there's this idea that somebody is either outstanding or poor and they need to be got rid of. And for most people, it's not like that. We're all, hopefully, still qualified teachers, we're still, qualifying teachers, and we need to stick to that. But if you're a qualified teacher, you've proved that you can be a teacher, you can be a competent teacher, you can do the job. So unless there will be some people who at some point become, it wasn't the right career choice for them. That should be a time minority. I mean, even Cummings here today said it's a small number of people, and I think we have to turn it around and realise that actually for the vast majority of us, we are well qualified, we are good at what we're doing, and sometimes we are outstanding and sometimes we're poor. But the main thing is that actually it's about us as teachers, whereas what's happening is we're looking at the results that children achieve and judging teachers on the basis of what the children outcomes are. And sometimes the outcome of the child has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good teacher or a good